All right, it's 12 o'clock. I think we will get started. Good afternoon. Hello. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for our webinar about Hawks on the Go. We are so excited to have you join us to learn more about basic Hawk ID and the fundamentals of Hawk migration with Lake Erie Metropark interpreter Paul Cipher. My name is Sarah Helson, and I am the program coordinator for Detroit Audubon, an organization dedicated to fostering the appreciation and conservation of birds and the environment that we share. We could not do the work we do without our funders and members, so I wanted to thank those of you who are members and are supporting projects like this. I also wanted to introduce Ava Landgraf. She is a Detroit Audubon's research coordinator, and she's assisting us today too. Thank you, Ava. You'll see her, she's the wren. Her camera is not working right now. So some quick Zoom housekeeping before we begin today. You're able to control your video and your microphone in the bottom left of your screen. So we ask that you keep yourself muted so that we don't receive feedback from your microphones or a dog barking. You can open the chat box by clicking on the chat button on the bottom of your screen. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please add any questions that you might have into the chat. If you have any further questions, please reach out to me. You can private chat and I will do my best to assist you. And now I'd like to introduce Paul Cipher, our speaker for today. He has been an interpreter at Lake Erie Metropark since 1994, and he saw his first Broadwing hawk kettle in 1993, and his life has never been the same. Thank you and welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much for having me. That's actually true. I still kind of struggle with the idea that I've been paying attention to this sort of stuff since the early 90s, but it's true. Where's the time gone? So thank you very much for having me today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to push my button here, and if all goes well, in just a moment, you should see what I want you to see. Share screen. And this one. So you should see a bald eagle in flight with the Hawks on the Go title. So I'm going to push this and we'll get started. So Hawks on the Go, here we go. One of the things I want to start with actually is a little bit of time travel. This is a photograph right out of one of our exhibits. It's in the upper exhibit room here at the museum. And these Native American clay vessels are basically, we'll say 1,300 years old. And what I want to do is I want to draw your attention to this one right here. And I'm going to highlight that particular region. And if you look at it, you'll see there's actually a series of funny little dots. So using the wonders of PowerPoint, I can actually give you a baseline idea of the pattern that is expressed in those dots. And if I make the pot disappear and I leave the pattern, and then I put that up there, it really, it doesn't take much of a stretch in your imagination to realize that they're pretty similar. The thing you got to keep in mind is that those clay vessels actually came from what archaeologists refer to as the Gibraltar site. Gibraltar is literally right next door to Lake Erie Metropark. And it doesn't take much imagination to figure out that if an accipiter is flying over Lake Erie Metropark, it just as easily could have flown over Gibraltar. And that same sort of logic applies to 1,300 years ago. So what we might want to consider with this is the idea that the individual that made this pot basically 1,300 years ago was constructing this pot in the middle of a hawk flight. And they looked up and were seeing these sorts of silhouettes. It's an idea I entertain, but I can't confirm it. I can't tell you that that is an accipiter profile any easier than an archaeologist can tell me it's not. We don't know. But what we do know is this particular window of time when these vessels were being crafted, they didn't do decorations like that. So this particular pot is actually different than a lot of the other ones because it has this potential silhouette of an accipiter. The reason I want to share that with you is because it illustrates the idea that people have basically been watching birds of prey for as long as there have been people to watch birds of prey. And I would like to think that in my line of work as an interpreter, you've got people that are in any corner of the world doing programs about birds of prey. So we could do that. We could take road trips and see these sorts of programs as they're conducted around the world from different people everywhere. But for our purposes, we're going to skip the global perspective and we're going to move forward in time, and we're going to go to the year 1983. And the reason I want to go to 1983 is because that's when the Hawk Watch started here at Lake Erie Metropark. And it had a very crafty name at the time. It was called the Lake Erie Metropark Hawk Watch. And it was all volunteer. So people would go work their real jobs and then come out and count hawks when they could. And then by the time the late 90s came around, it was figured out that, by golly, we're sitting on something special here. So let's take this volunteer outfit and let's make it a little bit bigger. And it literally became a nonprofit. It was a bona fide, federally recognized 501c3 organization called Southeastern Michigan Raptor Research. And that eventually ran its course. And fortunately, at the same time, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service was making a federal presence on the Detroit River. They're right up the street from Lake Erie Metropark at the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge. They have a friends group, the IWRA, International Wildlife Refuge Alliance. So the refuge and the Refuge Alliance basically work the Detroit River Hawk Watch. So it is technically a federal project. The Alliance generates the money while the refuge actually works the project. They're in charge of data. They're in charge of hiring counters. And this scene down here is basically what hawk watching is all about. The gentleman on the left is the designated official counter, and everybody else out there is either a volunteer or just enjoying the view with hopefully some birds to see. One thing that we have to consider when it comes to hawk watching is what in the world it actually is. It's what's officially called citizen science. So you don't get to be a hobby medical doctor. You're a licensed medical doctor. It's not a hobby. You don't get to play with uranium in your basement. That sort of stuff isn't allowed. And in the case of uranium, it's just a really bad idea. But you can go work a day job and then go do bird surveys. And when you submit those surveys out for the greater good, you're a public citizen and you are officially conducting science. So we call it citizen science. In the case of a hawk watch, it's exactly that. You're watching hawks. And it's technically a standardized bird count. So you have to have the same location. You have to be at the same, use the same protocols. You're using the same sets of record keeping, all for the same duration. And the premise is you do it year after year after year after year, so you can get some sort of consistency with your data. So if you move your location, or if you only count for an hour a day or something like that, as the time goes by, your lack of consistency will chew holes in your data, and it's harder and harder to draw conclusions. So it's really important to do everything the same way every year. If you look on the picture on the left, all those red dots represent hawk watches all across the United States and Canada, and actually one down there in the extreme southern reaches of Mexico. When it comes to hawk watching, they are not a unique thing to Southeast Michigan. They're all over the country. What this graphic does not represent is the fact that there's basically two seasons for hawk watching. You have spring hawk watches and you have fall hawk watches. Lake Erie Metropark is a fall hawk watch. We count the birds from September into November. A spring hawk watch, depending on your location, you might be counting from February into June. It just depends. But every site has its own protocols, and then all the data gets pooled so conclusions can be drawn. So here's an example of a conclusion that was pulled from Lake Erie Metropark data. It's the increase in bald eagles from 1991 to 2016. This puts actual numbers on the page that allows people to figure out, yes, indeed, there are more bald eagles now than there were 25 or 30 years ago. When you can put numbers on a page, plots on a chart, numbers in a cell on a spreadsheet. You're taking your science to another level, and this is where your hawk watching data can really start to come into play. This trend with the increase in bald eagles is something that hawk watches all across the country have documented. Unfortunately, some of those documentations can go the wrong way. So if you look at the American kestrel data from Cape May, New Jersey, Cape May, New Jersey is the very southern tip of New Jersey. You're looking at a pretty significant decline in kestrel numbers since the 1970s. This, unfortunately, is something that a lot of hawk watches are indeed starting to document. But here's the twist, is the hawk watch data doesn't tell you what the problem is. The hawk watch data only shows what is happening. It doesn't show you why it is happening. So in the case of the kestrel, the numbers are in decline, but we need more information before we can start assessing why they are actually in decline. This storyline played out with bald eagles. There is a hawk watch site in eastern Pennsylvania. It's called Hawk Mountain, and they have data going back into the 1940s. And they were able to document clearly and concisely in the 1950s and 60s a significant decline in bald eagles. They also noticed that the bald eagles that they were seeing were all adult birds. And that's a clear indication to a biologist that something is happening with reproduction where you're not having enough replacement of the older dying birds with the younger birds. You should not see all adults. Well, we were, or specifically they were at Hawk Mountain. And this led the researchers to start thinking through the problem, and they realized we got to get into the nests and see what's going on. And before you know it, they've pinned the problem on DDT, which was the poison that was interfering with eggshell development. So the question then becomes, if we did not have Hawk Mountain data to contribute to this problem of DDT, how much longer would it have taken before those problems started to manifest themselves in the world of people? Specifically, you're looking at birth defects here with these two bald eagles in these photographs. Their beaks are crossed. What would have happened if this continued and moved its way further up the food chain and came to our specific world? So what you're doing when you're doing this hawk watch stuff, this hawk migration study, you are literally just kind of testing the waters around you and looking for the possibility of potential problems. You could argue that a bird of prey is the canary in the coal mine, and that by monitoring their populations over time, you can get a feel for what's happening in the world around you. In order to make this migration storyline, I think, a little bit more relatable, I'm going to turn you all into a Broadwing hawk. This is an immature Broadwing. If you're familiar with the adults, their tail is actually a beautiful black and white striped pattern. So if you are the Broadwing hawk, do they nest in Michigan? Yes, they do. Do they nest in Canada? In absolutely mind-blowing numbers. The breeding densities in Canada are absolutely incredible. But it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're the Broadwing in Michigan or the Broadwing in Canada, you're still a Broadwing, and that means you like to eat cold-blooded stuff. So you don't eat a rabbit, and you don't eat a fish. You're eating things like toads and salamanders and snakes and birds and maybe the occasional mouse. The small stuff, a lot of the cold-blooded stuff. If you are a cold-blooded animal and these seasons move into September and October, as the days get shorter and the nights get colder, as a cold-blooded animal, you're basically going down for the count. You find yourself somewhere else, or you find yourself getting ready for winter. You find your place to hide for the season, and you come back out in the springtime if you survived. So if you are a bird, like a Broadwing hawk, that eats cold-blooded animals, you are in big trouble in the forests of Canada when the cold season comes, because there won't be any food. But here's where a lot of the miscommunication starts to come into play. The Broadwing hawk is not going to leave the forests of Canada because it doesn't have access to food. If it waits that long, it's going to be in serious trouble because there won't be any food at all. They don't wake up and say, wow, all my food is gone, I have to go now. They basically wake up in the morning and instinctively realize, I'm going to be losing my food. I better get out of here now while I still can. So the question is what's actually going on that triggers that urge for them to migrate? What is the timepiece? What is the connection to their environment that tells them leave now while you still can? The answer, interestingly enough, is what's called photoperiod. And photoperiod is literally the length of daylight. So they don't wake up and say, oh, it's cold, I'm going to leave now. They wake up and say, you know what? I think the sun came up a little later this morning than it did a week ago. And I think the sun's setting a little earlier than it did a week ago. And I know instinctively that my food is going to leave. So I better get out of town right now while I can. Photo period is key. And this is a significant factor in any and all bird migration. It doesn't matter if you're the Broadway hawk, if you're the golden eagle, or if you're the black-throated green warbler, it doesn't matter. Photo period is humongous. It's a major, major factor in all of this. Which brings us to one of the stupidest games in the history of game shows. This is called Plinko, and it's on The Price is Right. And there is exactly zero skill involved with this game. You could train a dog to do it. There's nothing to it at all. You walk up the stairs and you take this little hockey puck like disc and you press it flat against the board. And when you drop it, it bounces off these little pegs and eventually ends up in a slot down here. And if you did absolutely nothing to earn it, you could still walk away with $10,000 just because of the way the little puck bounced. Or depending on how it bounced, you could end up with $0, which doesn't matter because you still didn't earn any effort here. You didn't do anything constructive to earn this. Anybody can play this game. The reason I highlight Plinko of all things is because it actually, the premise of Plinko plays into hawk migration, believe it or not. So this is a multi-million-dollar graphic. The green line here represents land, and the yellow thing up here represents the sun, of course. And as the sun rises in the sky, it starts to heat up the ground. And it turns out that the ground does not heat up evenly. So you end up with these scattered rising columns of warm air, and we're going to call it a thermal. Now keep in mind the sun has to get high enough in the sky. So if the sun rises at, for example, 8 o'clock in the morning, that's too early for thermals because you don't have enough altitude for the sky or for the sun in the sky. It's not high enough. In September, your thermals start to form around 10 o'clock in the morning. That's when the sun starts to reach an appropriate height. So when you have these rising columns of warm air, keep in mind they're scattered across the landscape, and it depends on what's on the ground beneath it. So for example, a parking lot is all concrete, and it's going to heat up faster than the football field at the high school, which is going to heat up faster than, for example, the woodlot. So when you end up with these scattered locations for thermals, the birds actually will come along and they can detect the thermal. There's still some bickering and bantering as to how this happens. Clearly, if the bird enters the thermal, they can actually feel the air underneath them pushing them higher in the sky. Some people have speculated that as they get close to the thermal, they could potentially see it. Not necessarily see the air, but see the dust and the grit and the birds that are, or I'm sorry, the bugs that are being pulled up into the air as well. So we know they're going to feel the thermal. Some people think they're going to see the thermal, but the end result is the same. They get in the thermal and they get pushed up to the top. So you can think of it as you and I being in an elevator. You step in the elevator and next thing you know, you're on the 10th floor of a given building. In the case of a Broadwing hawk, they will set their wings into a glide, and they literally glide like a giant paper airplane over to the next thermal. And as they glide, because they don't have an engine per se, they're going to lose altitude. So as they lose altitude, they enter the next thermal and they get pushed up to the top again, and then they set their wings to a glide and off they go. They will do this with what's called a 10-to-1 ratio. That is tremendous. So basically for every 10 units of horizontal distance, they only lose 1 foot of vertical distance. So the example here with some pretty outrageous math, if the circumstances were absolutely perfect, for every 10 miles they covered, they'd only lose 1 mile of altitude. That's pretty impressive. Very few birds can pull that sort of thing off. The end result is simple. A Broadwing hawk is going to use very, very little energy as they move. They are soaring as they go up in the thermal. There's not a lot of active flapping. They're gliding as they move on to the next thermal. There's not a lot of active flapping. So they can cover 50, 60, 70 miles in a day, and they're not burning a lot of energy. An analogy that might help you think about it is the bicycle race in Europe, the Tour de France. The guys in front here are all huffing and puffing, trying to make it up this hill or down the hill and around the bend, dozens of miles a day. And then you get these two guys back here on the motorbike who are filming the whole thing. So who's burning more energy? The guys on the bicycle. Who's saving energy? The guys on the motorbike, even though they are running the same course. These guys are burning tremendous calories. These guys are not. So if I were going to pin an identity to one of these two groups of people, the scooter guy and the bicyclists, which one's going to be the Broadwing hawk? It's going to be the guy on the scooter, because they're basically cheating and they're taking advantage of the engine in the bike to help them cover the ground without having to burn all the energy. Here is a significant point. This is a big deal. Thermals do not form over water. It takes way too long for the thermal or for the water to warm up, and the thermal would never generate. You experience this every day that you're in the kitchen boiling water. You're making coffee, making pasta, whatever. You fill the pot with water, and when you have the unit on, it's red hot. If you touch it, you're going to get burned. You can feel the heat pouring out of it, but the water is nowhere near boiling yet. It takes time. Well, when you're talking about lakes the size of Superior and Lake Erie, there's just no way the thermals are going to form. So what ends up happening is the birds, as they're moving out of, for example, Canada, as soon as they reach that shoreline of Lake Erie, the Broadwings don't want to cross it, because it's basically 30 miles of open water, and they would have to flap every minute of the way. And if they do that, they're going to be burning way too much energy. And they don't want to commit all that energy use so early in their migration. So the end result is they go around the lakes, which brings us back to Plinko. How does the chip end up in the $10,000 slot and not the $0 slot? Because of the way it bounced around the pegs. If you were to remove the pegs from Plinko, it's just a straight shot down to the $10,000, and you stand a better chance of winning. The Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean basically function like the pegs on Plinko. And as these migrant hawks are coming southbound out of Canada, they go around them. Draw your attention, especially here. If you are at Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, if you're the bird that nests up here, for example, you come down, you hit the lake shore of Lake Ontario. No way, I'm not crossing it, it's too far. So you come around the bend, you come around Toronto, you reach Lake Erie. No way, I'm not crossing it. You move down the shoreline of Lake Erie and you get to the Detroit River. Now it's 4 miles of open water, but you got to do it because you're on a schedule. And that same body clock that says, I got to get out of Canada is the same body clock that says, I can't turn around and come all the way back over here to Buffalo and then come down the Appalachian Mountains. I got to cross the Detroit River. When it comes to these lake issues here, you don't have Great Lakes out in the Great Plains, so you do not have anything to concentrate birds of prey in their migration in the Great Plains. That's why you don't see hawkwatches out there. You can go to the Rocky Mountains and see them, but you're not going to see a hawkwatch in the middle of Kansas because there is nothing to concentrate the birds over Kansas. So hawkwatches are set up in locations that would, just by the nature of geography, concentrate the birds. Spring migration works exactly the same way, just going in the other direction. The birds don't want to cross the lakes, so they just get funneled around the lakes based on the land mass. The geography here in western Lake Erie changes significantly if you are a northbound bird versus a southbound bird. There is no spring hawkwatch at Lake Erie because it's not worth your time. There wouldn't be enough birds flying over the park to make it worth your while. But what about a place like Whitefish Point right up here in the Upper Peninsula? Yes. What about a place right here in the Straits of Mackinac? Yes. What about over here in Duluth? Yes. So some hawkwatches get it going both ways, like Duluth. Some hawkwatches like Lake Erie Metropark, that's not the case. To emphasize this lake issue, I want you to think about something. When I was a kid, there was a Bugs Bunny cartoon where basically Bugs Bunny turns into a little vandal and he runs around the country causing trouble. And one of the things he does is he saws off the state of Florida, literally, and kicks it away off into the Caribbean. One of the other things he did was he filled up the Grand Canyon. Now, we all know that nobody's going to fill up the Grand Canyon. It's just too big. But just take the visual for a minute. What if we filled up the Great Lakes? What if I took the Great Lakes and I contacted the local cement company and I said, fill up all the Great Lakes? If we did that, the entire Great Lakes geography would change. There would no longer be open bodies of water that don't heat up. There'd be no longer any blockages preventing the birds of prey from moving straight through the region. And next thing you know, all hawk migration studies in the Great Lakes would be irreparably changed because there wouldn't be any locations to concentrate the birds. If you like bird migration, specifically hawk migration, you have to take a moment and appreciate the Great Lakes. They make it happen, okay? By the same token, this guy here, or these guys, two of them, they're in a bobsled, and if you've ever seen this event in the Olympics, these people are flying down this track, okay? And that's the analogy I like to use when I talk about a different mechanism that we here in the Great Lakes don't get to experience. If you are a mountaintop, and this is a mountaintop, again, very advanced illustration there, and the wind is coming from the west or the northwest, when it hits the side of the mountain, it goes up the side of the mountain, okay? This is probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous hawkwatches in the world. It's called Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And believe it or not, you are actually looking a little bit more to the northeast. North, I believe, is over here somewhere. So as the wind comes across the landscape and hits the side of this ridge, it gets deflected up. And what ends up happening very simply is the birds come shooting down the ridge straight at you. If they get too far away from the ridge, they can no longer benefit from the deflected air that is pushing them up in the sky. And anytime a bird has the opportunity to get pushed up into the sky, they're saving energy. So there's two different mechanisms for hawk migration. One is the thermals impacted by Great Lakes, and the other is deflected air coming off the side of a mountain. Well, we don't have mountains in Wayne County, Michigan, so this mechanism does not apply, but it does apply elsewhere. For the record, they have to be close enough to benefit from the deflected air coming off the ridge. which leads to scenes like this. This is a classic photograph that was taken, I believe, in the 1930s, when people used to go to the top of Hawk Mountain, not for the sake of watching the birds of prey, but for the sake of shooting them as they flew by. Even though they were technically protected, a lot of people were shooting them anyways because birds of prey were viewed as vermin. So if you're going to be shooting a bird with a shotgun, that bird has to be close to you. And that's one of the wonderful mechanisms that makes Hawk Mountain such a spectacular place, is the birds, you can almost reach out and touch them. They're so close to you. Whereas a lot of these Great Lakes sites, Lake Erie Metropark included, you don't necessarily get super, super close views of the birds. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, they're always at a much closer distance, and in many cases, you're looking at literally shotgun distances if you were up there 100 years ago. So going back to Southeast Michigan, the red star right there represents the location of the boat launch at Lake Erie Metropark, and that's where the official hawk counting is done. Remember, there's a function of protocols and consistency, and once upon a time, the Hawk Watch would relocate up and down the shoreline depending on what the winds are doing. That is no longer done. The boat launch is the only location for the Hawk Watch. Basically, the birds come across the Detroit River, and as they come across the Detroit River from Ontario, remember that glide ratio. They may pick up some lift off of Grosse Ile or maybe Hickory Island down here, but as a general rule, they lose altitude as they come across the Detroit River, which means they're lower in the sky here than they would be over Ontario. And if you calculate out that 10-to-1 ratio, it's almost a half a mile of altitude that they would lose crossing the Detroit River. Now, here's where it gets frustrating for hawk watchers around here, is winds can play a factor. So the red arrows coming up off the bottom of your screen would represent a south wind. And what happens on a south wind is very, very simple. The flight lines just get pushed to the north. The birds are still moving from the east to the west. They're just making landfall in Michigan at a different spot. By the same token, if the winds are out of the north, the flight lines get pushed to the south. This is why historically the Hawk Watch would actually go to different locations. South winds, we'd move up the river. North winds, we'd come down here to the Point Mouillet State Game Area headquarters. Here's the beauty of it. You can do whatever you want. You are the visitor, you are the park patron, and you are not obligated to stay at the boat launch. Only the counting team is. So if you were to come to the boat launch and the counting team says, I think those birds are making landfall in Elizabeth Park up here in Trenton, then go to Elizabeth Park. You can do that. The counters cannot. They have to stay in the park. The red star up here in the corner, upper left, is approximately the location of my house. My wife and I, we purchased a home in New Boston a couple of years ago. And 2 out of the last 3 falls, we have had Broadwing Hawk flights over our house. This is very significant because basically, if the conditions are right and you live in Southeast Michigan, you could conceivably see hawk migration right over your house. I was watching the names come into the chat room there, and somebody identified themselves as living in Allen Park. You could have a hawk flight over Allen Park if the time of year is good and the winds are pushing the birds over your house. In our case, I watched these birds basically fly directly east-west, and they got to my neighborhood at about 5:30. And at that point, I was watching the thermal, and I could see that the thermal was starting to break apart. And sure enough, the birds dropped out of the thermal, and they dropped like little rockets right into the woods in my immediate vicinity. I watched it happen. So if you live literally anywhere down here, just pay attention to the skies above you in September or for that matter, October and November, and you could see migrant birds right over your house. One thing to consider is to pay attention to a little bit of the weather. Hawk watchers like to pay attention to that. And one of the things we look for in the fall is a cold front passing through the region. When you have a cold front that passes through the region, this being my cold front, and I move it through the region like that, what you end up with is, because it's a low pressure center, the winds go counterclockwise. And what ends up happening is after the cold front has moved through the region, your winds settle down. They tend to have some sort of a northerly component. The air is a little drier. The barometric pressure has increased, and all of those things contribute to a hawk flight. So basically, if, for example, it rains on Monday and it's expected to be nice weather on Tuesday and Wednesday, I would consider coming to the park on Tuesday and Wednesday. The cold front is the rain is the cold front. Once those things pass, everything falls into place and the birds follow behind the cold front, okay? These 3 video loops I shot with my smartphone. And this first one over here on your left is from my front yard of all places. So I'm gonna push the play button and I want you to watch what these birds are doing. So this is a kettle, and basically this is the thermal. You'll notice there's no birds up here, there's no birds down here, there's a cluster here, and it kind of snakes up into the sky just like this. It's almost like there's an invisible barrier containing the birds. I'm looking across the horizon at that scene, and what's happening is that is the thermal. So this area is the thermal. This area over here where the mouse is wagging is not the thermal. This is where the lift is. This is not the lift, okay? I'm gonna come over here to the middle image. This one was also filmed at Lake Erie Metropark, except I want you to watch the patterns of the birds. Notice that they're just all milling around at this point. The birds are directly overhead. They're directly overhead. So they're basically spinning around and they're gaining lift because the thermal was basically generating off the museum parking lot. You'll notice that some of the birds are actually sneaking out to the top of your screen. I'll play it again. You'll notice that some of the birds are basically sneaking out the top of your screen. And it's at that point where those birds figured out instinctively, I think I've gotten all the lift I'm gonna get out of this thermal. I'm gonna leave, and I'm gonna go find the next thermal. And if you watch really closely, maybe a dozen or so just left the top of the screen. Which brings us over to the far right side. There's no thermal here in this picture. All of these birds are streaming. The yellow line on your screen is not a glitch. This is the image that illustrates how counters count 10,000 birds, 20,000 birds. Basically, the plan is you draw an imaginary line in the sky, and when the birds cross the line, you count them with a handheld clicker, and every time your thumb hits the button, it tallies as a 1. If you think you're going to count the birds in this picture here in the middle, you can't really do it. You think you're going to count them this way in the left, you can't really do it. So I'm going to push the button and you'll see how it works. And just watch as the birds just cross that yellow line right there. That's how they do it. There is no yellow line in the sky. It's an imaginary line that the counter creates. And that's how they do it. Now, admittedly, this system can break down. And when you have 50 and 100 birds at a time crossing the horizon or crossing your imaginary line, your system's going to fall apart. And then you switch clickers because that's the different clicker that is designated for 10 at a time or 50 at a time. And you do that depending on how crazy the hawk flights get. If it gets absolutely crushing in terms of how many birds are coming across the river, you can start doing what's called a block count. So if you look at this image here in the middle, imagine that that is one binocular view. And let's just say for the sake of our argument, there's 200 birds in there. You would then just scan with your binoculars, 1 view, 2 view, 3 views, 4 views, 4 binocular views, 200 birds apiece. I just counted 800 birds. Hawk watch numbers are an estimate, but you've got to remember that it is the low end estimate. You don't count birds you didn't see because you didn't know they were there. It doesn't make any sense. You find yourself counting the bare minimum. So when you see a hawk watch total that says 100 sharp-shinned hawks, it was no less than 100, and it was almost certainly more. So once the birds have crossed the Detroit River into Michigan, they get counted again down here in Corpus Christi, Texas. They get counted again in Veracruz, Mexico. They get counted again down there in the Straits of Panama. And then they actually spend the winter in northern South America. Then comes springtime. By golly, they do the whole trip all over again. So if you're fascinated with how a little migrant songbird can go from Canada to Colombia, or if you're fascinated with how the monarch butterfly goes from Lake Erie Metropark to the mountains of central Mexico, Broadwing hawks basically do the same principle. Tremendous, tremendous distances, literally to areas south of the equator. When it comes to hawk migration, it is on a timetable. We say September, October, November generically, but each species of bird has its own timetable. So for example, if you look at this very first one here, the osprey, you'll see them in September. Here's your timeline down here. You'll see them in September and into October, and basically by the time you get to November, they're done. If you wanted to see, for example, a golden eagle, it works the other way. You'll notice that there are very, very few September records. They don't even register on our chart. And by the time you get to the early reaches of October, they start to pick up speed a little bit, and you'll see golden eagles largely in November and some of October. The Broadwing hawk is very attention-getting. And what you're looking at here is this tremendous peak in the middle of September, and then by Halloween, they are done. So a question we often get is, when is the best time to see migrating hawks? And the answer could potentially be, which hawk do you want to see? If you want to see an osprey versus a red tail and anything in between, each one is on its own timetable. Generally speaking, hawk watches start their counts around 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'll wrap them up, generally speaking, around 6 p.m. Notice, by the way, as these two black bars swing into view, that there are kind of almost like a planetary alignment thing. And with a little bit of luck, in the second week of October, you have the possibility of seeing all 16 birds of prey in a day. And that has happened on at least 2 occasions. Basically, you have to have late Broadwings, you have to have an early cluster of golden eagles and rough-legged hawks. It does not happen often, but it can and has. A couple things to remember when it comes to hawk watching. I use the Broadwing example because it's a good, easy, fun one. They must have thermals, but not everybody has to have them. So for example, the Broadwing hawk has to have them, but the northern harrier can get by without them. So the way to say that is, all birds will use the thermals, but not everybody relies on them. The northern harrier does not care about crossing open water. They have been observed at Whitefish Point, launching themselves off the beach and flying over Lake Superior, which is quite a distance for a hawk to be flying, and they simply don't care. A Broadwing hawk would never fly over Lake Superior. The open water analogy also works out to a bad weather vision, and the rough-legged hawk is a great example of that. I have been at the hawk watch when the rains set in and when the snow starts to fall, and by golly, you can see rough-legged hawks. They don't care. A Broadwing hawk is not going to fly in the rain if it doesn't have to. A Broadwing hawk certainly won't fly in the snow. If it's still here when there's snow, that Broadwing hawk is almost certainly dead. So when it comes to these these ideas that I've introduced to you, keep in mind some of them don't universally apply. Some birds fly farther than others. The red-tailed hawk may nest in Ontario, maybe outside of Windsor, fly to Ohio, and then call it a season and stay in Ohio. Whereas a Swainson's hawk is going to fly all the way to South America. Not all migrant hawks are programmed to fly the same distances. There's a lot of variety. And keep in mind, all your hawk watches have their own best conditions. So if you go to Hawk Mountain, they really like to see their northwest winds because that's when the winds hit the ridge at the ideal compass orientation. Here at Lake Erie Metropark, we don't need a northwest wind. We'll take any north wind, we'll take an east wind, we'll take a west wind. What we don't like are southeast winds. Those are the winds that come off of Lake Erie, and those are not ideal. I want to give you some basic ideas with bird of prey identification. And before I go any further, I want to credit Jerry Jordan and Andy Sturgis. They took all these images, and then I'm pretty sure Jerry assembled these graphics. I talked to Jessie at the Wildlife Refuge, and she said, absolutely use them. So these are assembled. I assembled the PowerPoint pages to just kind of put things into fundamental groups. Now, a turkey vulture and a bald eagle and a golden eagle is like an apple, an orange, and a cantaloupe. They're three completely different birds, even though the bald eagle and the golden eagle are both considered eagles. But I put them on the same page to show you that they're big, dark birds. And identification of big, dark birds is actually very simple once you know what you're looking for. One of the things you're paying attention to is the wing posture. So the bald eagle likes to keep its wings flat. The turkey vulture likes to keep its wings in a V. And believe it or not, so does the golden eagle. They like to keep their wings in a V as well when they are gliding. So it's flat versus V if you go counterclockwise around the screen. Also pay attention to where the white is. So if it's a bald eagle, white head, white tail, a kindergartner can figure that one out. But if the white is scattered all over the body, that's just an immature bald eagle. Turkey vultures are not going to have scattered white. They are two-toned, dark and silver. The golden eagle, well, yeah, they can have dark and they can have white, but look where the white always is. It's in patches. A patch on the wing, a patch on the wing, and a patch on the tail. If it is an immature bird. If it is an adult bird, they are completely dark. This is kind of like a drawing, if you will. It's a completely black bird. So paying attention to where's the white, and what's the posture of the wing, you got a lot going for you when it comes to identifying the bigger dark birds. Identification of accipiters will frustrate you if you are not familiar with how to do it. Separating sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks to a lot of people is probably one of the most frustrating dimensions of hawk watching. We don't get many goshawks here, so there's not even a graphic for it right now. But one thing to consider when it's separation of sharp-shinned hawk and Cooper's hawk is to pay attention to the front end of the bird and to pay attention to the back end of the bird. If you look at the front end of the bird on the sharp-shinned hawk, they have a tiny head and the wings are often thrown way forward, which makes their head look even smaller. Whereas the Cooper's hawks, they like to keep their wings a little bit more straight and they have a larger head. So the overall shape on the front end of the bird is actually quite different if you look at it. Second of all, you can look at the end of the tail. On a Cooper's hawk, it tends to be more rounded. And on a sharp-shinned hawk, it tends to be squared off like you cut it with a pair of scissors. I know that there are hawk watching veterans who do not use the tail shape at all. I've weaned myself away from that. Believe it or not, one of the best ways to identify these two birds is by their wing beat. It's completely different once you know exactly what you're looking for. However, if you are a beginner, I do encourage you to pay attention to that tail because the truth is it works a lot of the time. In fact, it works most of the time. So it's something to grab onto, and then after a while, you realize there's other better field marks that you can use. 10,000 Sharpshin hawks in a season is not unheard of. There have been days with 1,000 Sharpshin hawks or more. That is tremendous. So in the end, you're going to get a lot of practice here separating Sharpshin hawks from Cooper's hawks. These are the bootios, and that is that is how you pronounce that word. It's a very goofy word in bird circles. It's called a bootio, and the Broadwing hawk is a bootio. It's a soaring bird. So their wing profile is more about how to gain lift, and of course that's ideal with their use of thermals. If you look at this bird right here in the top right of the Broadwing panel, there's that black and white tail I was referencing. Oops, I want to back up for a minute. There we go. Over here is your red-shouldered hawk. I'm sorry, red-tailed hawk. And by golly, they have red tails, which is, of course, where they get their name. But if you look on the leading edge of the bird, there's a bar, there's a little bar, here's a bar, here's a bar. It's called a patagial bar, and only red-tailed hawks have those. If you are driving in Southeast Michigan and it's the 4th of July weekend and you see a hawk in a tree, it's almost certainly going to be a red-tailed hawk. If it's the dead of winter, it may not be the red-tailed hawk. It could actually, with a little bit of luck, be a rough-legged hawk. This is the one that actually nests in the Arctic. And when they come south for the winter, their south might be Michigan or Ohio. That's it. You can go to the Upper Peninsula and see them around Sault Ste. Marie. You don't go to Florida and look for a rough-legged hawk. They don't make it that far south, which emphasizes my relativity thing. Not all birds do all of this the same way. Some birds migrate a few hundred miles, some go a lot more. The red-shouldered hawk absolutely has red shoulders. You can see it in the upper left bird there in the red-shouldered hawk panel. But that's not really an ideal field mark. Believe it or not, the tip of the feathers here, or I should say the base of the wingtips, has a field mark that's called a crescent, and the sunlight comes right through it. And if you look at just this tiny little image right there, you can actually see where the tip of the wings show those crescents. You can see that in the field. Yesterday, I was outside with a coworker briefly, and we had a red-shouldered hawk, and which is an unusual September bird, not preposterous, but unusual. And those wing crescents could not be more obvious. It was a great learning experience for her. My coworker, not the bird. Over here is the Swainson's hawk, and the Swainson's hawk is basically a bonus bird. They nest in the western United States. They nest in western Canada. And when their breeding season is done, they sometimes disperse over to the eastern portions of Canada. And then when the migration gets underway, this western bootio is actually observed in the eastern United States. We get them basically every fall here in the park, maybe 1, maybe 6, that's it. You can see 250,000 Broadwings by the time the season ends if everything is awesome. When it comes to Swainson's hawks, half a dozen would be considered awesome. Falcons are a completely different class of birds. They do have longer tails like the accipiters do, but all of their wings are pointed, and it's a engineering suggestion of speed. So backing up really quick, the bootios are all about soaring. The accipiters, these shorter wings with a longer tail, that gives them the opportunity to slice their way through even the thickest vegetation to grab another bird, which is the mainstay of an accipiter's diet. In the case of falcons, they tend to have pointy wings. That's an indication of speed. The Peregrine Falcon is amazingly fast, especially when they drop out of the sky in what's called a stoop. The Merlin is also pretty doggone fast. And because it is not much bigger than a kestrel, in fact, it's basically the same size as a kestrel, a small object moving fast looks like it's moving even faster. So when you have this dark falcon that just goes rocketing past the hawk watch like it got shot out of a cannon, you can almost say with certainty it was going to be a Merlin. Small, dark, and fast. Kestrels, nowhere near as fast. They're a little bit more on the dainty side, and the overall appearance is much lighter. The Merlin, by the way, is a great example of hawk migration and how it works. Hawk migration is what you see, it is not what is. And I'll say that again. Hawk migration is what you see, it is not what is. So if you look at this middle image of the Merlin, it's basically a light bird with dark markings on it. But you take that bird and you push it higher and higher and higher in the sky, and the whole bird starts to become dark and eventually becomes black. Is it a black bird? No. It's a light colored bird with a lot of dark markings. But in the field, what you see is the darkness, but it's not a dark bird. It's kind of a funky concept. The Northern Harrier is all by itself in terms of our bird of prey roster. This is the bird that can look like anything you want it to be. So if you look at this image right here that I'm circling with the mouse, that one actually is somewhat suggestive of a Cooper's hawk, believe it or not. And if you look at images like this one right here or this one right here, that can actually start to take on characteristics of a peregrine, believe it or not. And I have seen seasoned people get fooled by Harriers. They will trick you. They will fly in the rain, they'll fly in the snow, but one of the dead giveaways is that white patch right there. It is a very diagnostic mark, and you can see it from pretty tremendous distances. So what's baseball have to do with this? I'll tell you. If you ever have paid attention to baseball, you would know that sometimes baseball games are full of excitement, and sometimes they're a little bit on the slower side. And Murphy's Law tells you that as soon as you go buy your $15 hot dog, then, oh, you missed the home run that was hit by your favorite player. That's how life works at a baseball game. Hawk watching is very similar. So you can look at it and say, I have Saturday off. I'm going to go to the Hawk Watch on Saturday and not see a doggone thing. The whole day is very slow and uneventful. And then you have chores to do on Sunday, and then you find out, oh, Sunday was a blockbuster day. That's life at the Hawk Watch. That's just how it is. So what you need to do is you need to think about investing more time, and then hopefully you can be there on the days that get really, really exciting. How do you get to find out about this sort of stuff? You can visit two websites. One is Humana.org, the Hawk Migration Association of North America. They are the support group. They are the parental group, if you will, that oversees all the Hawk Watch data. So all the Hawk Watches report their data to the Hawk Migration Association of North America. It's chunked out into this absolutely spectacular database called Hawk Count. Hawkcount.org is how you get to it. So literally what you do every night in the fall is you come over here on the left side, find your Hawk Watch, and you can see what was counted at Holiday Beach in Ontario. You can see what was counted at Hawk Mountain, because all the Hawk counts have their counters submit the information that night. So the opportunity to get to these two websites is not to be overlooked. Spend a little bit of time and poke around, okay? Now, I want to tackle this. This is critical, okay? Because I know some of you are thinking, when is the big Broadwing Hawk going to, the big Broadwing Hawk flight going to be, okay? Now hear this. This is my unofficial prediction, okay? This is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday from the Weather Channel, okay? South winds are a bust, south winds are a bust. And I also want you to pay attention to this graphic right here. This first line right here is the 16th, and then there's a dot for the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and then 21st. This is the summation of all the Hawk Watch data from Lake Erie Metropark. You can see very clearly that the Broadwing Hawk peak centers between the 16th and the 21st. However, you can't use just this. You also have to partner it with the weather. Look what happens to our temperatures. They drop off Friday and Saturday. Look what happens to the winds here, south and southwest. And then Thursday is actually going to be a little bit of a northeast wind, but there's a risk of rain. And that tells me that the barometric pressure is not going to be ideal. Friday, the risk of rain gets even lighter. And by the time you get to Saturday, the winds are east with a little bit of a north bite. It's going to be nice and chilly, which means the cold front has passed and there's no expected rain. And how does this jive with this? It's a perfect fit. So it is my prediction, if I can be so bold, that Friday and Saturday have the potential to be very, very nice days here at Lake Erie Metropark. By Sunday, not so much, because my feeling is any birds that wanted to go would have gone on Friday and Saturday. We've experienced that, where Friday, basically everything moves and there's nobody left for Saturday until the next cold front moves through. If it means anything to you, I've already reached out to my wife after I looked at this data this morning, and she will be taking a sick day on Friday. I am already off on Friday. We will be here. You can count on that. I'm not convinced it's going to be Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I'm angling towards Friday and Saturday. What to bring when you come to the Hawk Watch? Bring a chair, a soft one, because sitting on a picnic table is not the most comfortable thing, hours on end. Sun protection, whatever you need. It can be, sunscreen, a hat, or what have you. That's obviously up to you. I say appropriate weather gear because you could be out here on Labor Day weekend and it's 90 degrees. You're back out here on Thanksgiving and it's 20 degrees and snowing. That's just how it works. We do have fast food nearby. There's some pizza places. There's an A&W right outside the park that stays open. So definitely bring food if you're looking to make it a full day. Bring some optics of some sort. Binoculars are at the minimum. The opportunity to bring a spotting scope would be great because we are not Hawk Mountain. A lot of our birds have the potential to be far away, and a spotting scope is a nice addition. A field guide, whatever it's going to be anymore. It could be a book, it could be your phone or a tablet or what have you, but definitely bring a few things to make your stay here a little bit more comfortable. So I'm going to stop the share, and I am, where'd Sarah go? There's Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
I'm here.
I'm all ready for questions. I could actually see the signals coming in that people were posting questions, but I don't know what they were. So were you going to moderate that?
Yes.
I'll be
Ava.
going through questions.
Okay, Ava. Okay, great. Okay.
And
Okay.
just real quick before we start, it is 1 o'clock, so we want to, but Paul has said he'll stay on to answer questions. So stay if you'd like, and thank you, Paul, too.
You bet.
Okay. Now our first question is, what is the Hawk Watch site at the Louisiana-Texas border? Do you know?
Hawkwatch site. I am not aware of a Hawkwatch at the Louisiana-Texas border.
Okay.
As I think through the geography of the area as I know it, it seems like it'd be a great place to have one, but I do not know what it is by name. I'll bet
Okay.
you can go to the Humana website and go find it.
Perfect. Oh, and then that actually is the next question, which you did cover. Is there a website to go to that will list the different Hawk Watch areas?
Yep.
And you did provide those two websites. We could maybe, Sarah, could you possibly put those in the chat maybe so that people can copy and paste them if they want?
Sure thing.
Okay. And then the next question is, do birds feed on the bugs that are pulled up into the thermals?
I would suggest the answer to that would actually be no. Um, very few birds of prey that fly through here are actually eating a lot of bugs. The American kestrel would be, and Merlins they'll snag dragonflies and stuff. But I would propose the idea that no, they're in the thermals for lift, and they're not necessarily eating at the time.
Okay. Do you know which Native American tribe made the pot that you showed in the beginning?
I'd have to go back and double check my notes. Over the course of time, Native Americans have moved into the region, and then they leave the region. It's a fluid group of people. So who was here 5,000 years ago is not necessarily the same group of people that were here 300 years ago. Generally speaking, here in this corner of the state, you start to think about the Huron and the Huron. So I would consider that one, but I'd have to check my notes.
Yeah, yep, that makes sense. Do the hawks tend to take the UP down through Wisconsin instead of the Straits of Mackinac and down through the Mid?
That actually remains to be seen. There is a Hawk Watch site that's now set up at the Straits of Mackinac, and the counter is on the north side of the Straits in St. Ignace. And if there's any hawks flying by, he would actually record them. We know the Straits of Mackinac gets northbound flights, and the Hawk Watch is in Mackinac City. It's conceivable that the birds would come across the eastern portions of the Upper Peninsula and realize, I don't want to cross Lake Huron, I don't want to cross Lake Michigan, I'll go around it. Which would take them into Wisconsin. So I think that information still needs more data, quite frankly. And it could also be a seasonal thing too, where this particular calendar year, there was a tremendous hawk flight through Wisconsin that came out of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but not so much this year. You know, you go from year to year and see how it works out. I think we need more information.
Yeah. Where is Hawk Mountain Sanctuary?
Hawk Mountain is in eastern Pennsylvania. I think the largest nearest town is Kempton, Kempton. It's a couple hours out of Philadelphia, I believe. Okay. If you leave Michigan, I can't believe it's an 8-hour drive. It's just not that far. Of course, 8 hours is relative, right? But it's not far. It's eastern Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Next question. We are in downtown Detroit by the DeQuinder Cut. We have huge goose migrations through here. Do we also have broadwings?
You would have broadwings if the winds put the birds there.
Okay.
If the winds are strong enough from the south, you're not going to see a thing here at Lake Erie Metropark, and the birds are going to end up making landfall into Michigan, in the vicinity of places like Ecorse, River Rouge, Wyandotte. There have been episodes where broadwings have been recorded over downtown Detroit. There have been episodes where the winds were so obnoxious that the main hawk flight, if I can call it that, made landfall north of Lake St. Clair.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so the Lake Erie dimension works out a lot with the wind conditions, but sometimes they're so strong from the wrong direction, the hawk flight is pushed miles and miles away.
Yeah. Okay. Do the hawks migrate in their own groups, kind of together with their own species, or are they mixed species groups?
It's both. So in those 3 videos that I showed you, those were all Broadwing hawks. But the hawk counters know to pick through those kettles and look for the bird that's twice as big. In that case, it would be a candidate for a Swainson's hawk. So a Swainson's hawk will mix in with the Broadwing hawks. When all the Broadwing hawks are done, you could have a kettle of, for example, 50 red-tailed hawks, and then you pick through it and you realize, oh, that one's actually a red-shouldered. Oh, that one's actually a Cooper's hawk. So they do migrate in species-specific groups, like the Broadwing is a perfect example, but you will get other birds that do mix in, yes.
Oh, I think we might have lost Ava. I can take it on.
Sorry, my internet is going in and out.
Okay.
But I'm here. I'll keep going and see
Okay.
what happens. Do we get the Swainson's hawks in Detroit?
We barely get them here at Lake Erie Metropark. So to say, I wouldn't sit outside in Hart Plaza waiting for a Swanson's hawk to fly by. It would be incredibly, incredibly unlikely because they're unlikely in the first place. But in theory, yeah, you could get one over Detroit.
Okay. What geographical features prevent hawks in spring migration from just reversing their fall migration pattern at Lake Erie Metropark?
You need to look at a satellite image of Western Lake Erie, and you'll see that, and this is going to sound weird, but when you look at the picture, you'll see what I'm talking about. The very western part of Lake Erie proper, not Lake Erie Metropark, but Lake Erie, the lake, the very western shoreline is much farther west than Lake Erie Metropark. So as the birds move through Ohio and hit the south shore of Lake Erie, and they come around the western corner of Lake Erie, it's easier for them to just continue north to get to where they're going, as opposed to hugging the shoreline and then coming over to the northeast to get to Lake Erie Metropark. The only way you'd see a spring flight at Lake Erie Metropark is if you had strong west winds to blow the birds over there. I live in New Boston, and I have seen spring hawk flights over New Boston because the birds come around the corner and then they basically just set their compass for north. I saw the same effect when I lived in Milan, but a spring hawk flight in Wyandotte is too far to the east to make it worth the bird's time to get there.
Cool. Should bird watchers come to Lake Erie Metropark early in the morning, I think is what they mean.
If you're just into the birding thing in general, I encourage people to hit the trails for songbirds. And then if you make your way to the hawk watch by 9:30 or so, you probably will not have missed anything. Very few birds go that early. Sharpshin hawks and maybe some falcons. Broadwing hawks don't get going until after 10 o'clock. That's one of the fun dimensions of hawk watching is we have this idea in our head with birding in general that you have to get up at some stupid hour of the morning to go find them. And that's not true necessarily. And with hawk watching, it's absolutely not true. You can stay home, have a nice breakfast, do your banking, throw a load of laundry in, and if you get to the hawk watch by 9:30, you probably haven't missed anything.
Great. Okay, and our last question, any ideas on what the Mississippi River's impact may be on migration pathways? Last year on September 24th, we had a huge group of Broadwings pass through here in southeastern Iowa.
My hunch is that the Mississippi proper doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on it. The large group of Broadwings that was observed there in that instance, I think was just a function of the birds finding themselves in that area as they were moving southbound and somebody saw them. If you've got we'll say 50,000 Broadwings that fly over Lake Erie Metropark, you're going to have clusters of birds between here and Texas. Why aren't they being seen in Tennessee? Why aren't they being seen in Kentucky or southeastern Arkansas? because people aren't looking up. That's the big problem. People spend too much time looking down and not up. So I don't think the Iowa thing was a function of the river so much as it was just a function of the birds were in that area at the time and they were observed. Does that make sense? I hope it does.
It makes sense to me. And yes, we got an absolutely. So great.
Okay.
Thank you. And those are all of our questions. So thank you so much for answering those, Paul.
All right.
And I will hand it back to Sarah to wrap things up.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful, Paul. We really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank
Thank you for having me.
And we hope all of you enjoyed today's webinar. And we had some questions about whether you'd get the recording of this, and we do. We have all of your emails, so we'll be sending a recording as well as some of the resources, and hope
Great.
to see some of you out at Lake Erie maybe this weekend.
Maybe this weekend. Yeah.
I think Ava and I are going Friday, so we'll look for you.
Outstanding. I fully expect to be there. Yeah.
Great. And then, so coming up in October, we have some webinars. We have one on regenerative ecology on October 3rd and nocturnal animals of Belle Isle on October 29th. If any of you would like to join that, you can look on our website, on our Facebook page, and then also in our Flyway Express e-newsletter. So thank you again. Hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you all soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. God bless. Be safe.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Paul. I love the starting out with the artwork from the old pot. That was really wonderful.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. If you think back and make it even a more bigger picture thing, you can almost bet that the individual that made that did it in September, because that's when you're going to see that sort of bird traffic in September. You'll see hundreds, if not thousands, of accipiters in September. So it's neat just to say 1,300 years ago, September. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you again.
You're welcome. All right, Sarah, we'll see you, okay?
Thanks, Paul. Have a great one.
All right, you too.
See you later.